Maple Street in the eastern part of Manchester looked like the perfect embodiment of the American dream. Rows of two-story houses built in the 1990s, neat lawns, children's bikes on the driveways. In the mornings, the smell of freshly cut grass and coffee filled the air, and in the evenings, the laughter of children playing in the yards could be heard. But behind this facade of prosperity lay stories that people preferred not to share publicly. House number 47 was no different from its neighbors. Blue siding, white shutters, a small porch with a swing. Mark Collins bought it in 2008 when his construction company, Collins Construction, was thriving, and his wife Cynthia had just been promoted at Granite State Insurance. Back then, they dreamed of having a big family, planning to add a playroom to the house and maybe a pool in the backyard. Those plans died along with their only son, Ethan, 3 years ago. The boy was only 14 when a drunk driver hit him on a crosswalk near his school. Mark remembered every detail of that day, how Detective Morris from the Manchester Police Department stood at their door in his blue uniform, how Cynthia fell to her knees right in the hallway, how he himself couldn't say a word for 2 hours. Grief changed them in different ways. Cynthia threw herself into her work with such ferocity that her colleagues began to worry about her health. She reorganized files, rewrote procedures, worked 12 hours a day, as if trying to control at least her professional world now that her personal one had collapsed. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to have stopped in time. His once successful business began to lose money. He turned down large projects, couldn't concentrate on negotiations, and just sat in his truck for hours, staring into space. Dr. Susan Wright, the family psychologist they had been seeing for the first 6 months after the tragedy, explained this as a normal reaction to loss. People cope with grief in different ways, she said. The important thing is not to lose each other in the process. But they were already losing each other. Cynthia needed conversation, plans for the future, attempts to get back to life. Mark, on the other hand, sank deeper and deeper into silence. Buddy came into their lives by accident on that gray October day in 2022. Mark was coming home from work when he saw a small puppy on the side of Highway 101, a mix of Labrador and sheepdog, dirty, scared, clearly abandoned. Normally, Mark would have driven by, but something in the puppy's eyes stopped him. Maybe it was the same lostness he saw in the mirror every morning. He brought the dog home without telling Cynthia. She met him at the door with her usual question, "How was work?" and froze when she saw the gray-brown ball of fur in her husband's arms. "Mark, what's that?" Her voice sounded tired. "I found him on the road." He was dying. Cynthia looked at the puppy, then at her husband. For the first time in months, she saw something other than emptiness in his eyes. Not joy, not yet, but interest, concern. "All right," she said, "but tomorrow we're going to the vet." Dr. James Parker of Merrimack Veterinary Clinic determined the puppy was 3 months old, gave him the necessary vaccinations, and noted that he was in good health despite his exhaustion. "You're lucky you found him," he told Mark. "Another day or two, and it would have been too late." Mark named the dog Buddy, a friend, a simple name for a simple relationship. He wasn't going to replace his son with a dog, nor was he looking for human qualities in an animal. But Buddy became his shadow. He followed him around construction sites, slept in his workshop, and sat next to him when Mark sat silently for hours in his chair in front of the TV. For the first year, Cynthia was neutral about the dog. She fed him when Mark forgot, took him for walks if her husband was late from work. But gradually, Buddy became a symbol of their differences. Mark found in the dog a comfort that no human being, including his wife, could give him. Cynthia saw this attachment as an obstacle to restoring their relationship. "We could go on vacation," she said. "Remember how we wanted to rent a cottage by the sea in Maine?" "What about Buddy?" Mark invariably replied. "We can leave him at the kennel for a week." "No." These short dialogues were repeated with variations. Instead of a romantic dinner at a restaurant, Who will be with Buddy? Instead of a visit to Cynthia's sister in Boston, the dog needs his familiar surroundings. Instead of attempts to restore intimacy, there were long evenings when Mark petted Buddy and stared out the window, while Cynthia sat at the other end of the couch with her laptop. Tommy Henderson, their neighbor on the left, who worked for Wellsworth Manufacturing, often saw this scene in the Collinses' windows. He was 28 years old and had been living alone since his parents divorced, and he moved to Manchester a year ago. In the evenings, on his way home from the factory, he would involuntarily glance at his neighbor's lit windows. The silent family intrigued him with their quietness. "Strange people," he said to his colleague Dave King. "They live like roommates, not like spouses. He's always with that dog. She's always on the computer. They don't even talk." Dave, who had worked at the factory for 20 years and been through 2 divorces, just smiled. "Wait until you get married. You'll understand." But Tommy was curious. He knew about the Collins family tragedy. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about each other. He understood that people cope with grief in different ways, but this silence seemed unhealthy to him, tense, like a stretched string ready to snap. Cynthia felt this tension too. At work, she was a model of efficiency, processing insurance claims, meeting with clients, giving presentations. Her colleagues considered her one of the best agents in the office, but at home, she felt like a stranger. Her husband talked to the dog more than he talked to her. He met her plans for the future with silence. Her attempts at physical intimacy were met with polite refusal. "We can't go on like this, Mark," she said one evening in April, when he once again refused to go to his niece's wedding because of Buddy. Mark didn't look up from the dog. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. We live like ghosts. We don't talk, we don't make plans, we don't live. I live. With the dog. You live with the dog, not with me." Mark finally looked at her. In his eyes, she saw something that hadn't been there for 3 years, defensive aggression. "Buddy isn't to blame for our problems, Cynthia." "Am I to blame?" He didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. At night, lying in bed on opposite sides, they listened to each other's breathing and thought about how far they had gone down a road from which there might be no turning back. Buddy slept on a mat at the foot of the bed, sometimes whimpering in his sleep. Mark found more life in those sounds than in his wife's silence, and Cynthia listened and understood. There were 3 of them in this room, but she was the odd one out. Dr. Parker saw the Collins family every 3 months for Buddy's routine checkups. The dog was healthy, active, and attached to his owner with a loyalty rare in animals. But the veterinarian, who had worked for 30 years and seen hundreds of families, noticed the tension between the spouses. Mark talked only about the dog, while Cynthia stood aside, as if waiting for the visit to end. It was a classic picture of a family where a pet had become a battleground. "Is everything okay at home?" he asked Mark cautiously, during his last visit in May. "Yes, of course. Why?" "It's just that sometimes after the loss of a child, pets become a source of conflict in the family. People invest different emotions in them." Mark stroked Buddy behind the ear. "Everything's fine, Dr. Parker," but nothing was fine, and everyone knew it. Mark, Cynthia, even the neighbors, who no longer heard laughter coming from number 47, no longer saw the Collinses together in the yard or on the porch. They only saw Mark with the dog on his morning and evening walks, only Cynthia walking quickly from the car to the house, her eyes downcast. The spring of 2025 brought the first truly warm days. Apple trees bloomed on Maple Street, neighbors began working in their gardens, and children came out to play in the yards. Life was awakening after a long winter. But at number 47, winter continued, cold and silent, and only Buddy, who did not understand human complexities, continued to love his owner with a simple, unconditional love that had once saved both their lives and now, perhaps, was destroying another. June brought unusual heat to Manchester for New England. The temperature had been above 30 degrees for the second week in a row, and the air conditioners were running around the clock. The atmosphere in the Collins house was even more heated than outside. Cynthia decided to take action. During her years working at an insurance company, she had learned to make plans and follow them. Now she applied this approach to saving her marriage. In the notebook she always carried with her, she wrote a list of 7 items under the heading, Restoring the Relationship. Joint dinners without television, weekly dates, a vacation together, renewing sexual intimacy, family therapy, shared hobbies or interests, planning for the future. She started on Monday, June 9th. Cynthia cooked Mark's favorite meal, roast chicken with mashed potatoes, and set the table in the dining room, which they hadn't used in months. She lit candles and opened a bottle of red wine. Mark came home from work at his usual time, 6:30. Buddy greeted him at the door with his usual joyful bark, but instead of his usual snack standing in the kitchen, Mark saw a set table and his wife in a blue dress he hadn't seen her wear in a year. "What's this?" he asked cautiously. "Dinner. A normal dinner, like normal spouses have." Mark washed his hands, changed into a clean shirt, and sat down at the table. Buddy settled at his feet, as usual. For the first 15 minutes, they ate in silence, occasionally exchanging meaningless phrases about the weather and work. "Marilyn Curtis called today," Cynthia said as she poured wine. Marilyn was her colleague and only close friend. "She's inviting us to a barbecue on Saturday. The Thompsons will be there, the Whites, and a few other couples. I can't. I'm pouring a foundation on Monday, and I need to prepare the site. Mark, it's Saturday, 1 day off." "What about Buddy? Marilyn doesn't like dogs." Cynthia put down her fork. "He can stay home for 4 hours. He'll be bored." "My God, Mark, he's a dog, not a child." The words hung in the air like a slap. Both understood what had been said and what had been implied. Mark got up from the table. "Thanks for dinner." He went into the living room, Buddy following him. Cynthia sat among the uneaten food and burning candles, realizing that the first part of her plan had failed. Tommy Henderson heard their conversation through the open windows. The summer heat forced the neighbors to keep their windows open, and sounds carried easily between houses. He was painting the fence in his backyard and unwittingly witnessed the family scene. Cynthia's voice grew louder and louder, while Mark's voice grew quieter and quieter until it fell silent. "This is bad," Tommy thought, dipping his brush in the paint. The next evening, Cynthia tried a different approach. She bought tickets to the Palace Theater for a new Broadway musical. Mark loved music and had even played the guitar at one time. Maybe art would help them reconnect. "I have tickets for tomorrow," she announced at dinner. This time, they ate in the kitchen, without candles or wine. "What?" "Hamilton. Remember we wanted to see it?" Mark chewed his spaghetti without looking up. "It's Thursday. I have a meeting with the electrical contractor at 8 o'clock on Friday morning. The show ends at 10:30. You'll be home by midnight." "What if there's traffic?" "Mark, please." "One night. For us." He finally looked at her. His eyes showed the weariness of someone being forced to do something he didn't want to do. "Okay," he said quietly. But on Thursday at 6:30, Mark called from work. "I'm having problems with the excavator. I can't make it." Cynthia went to the theater alone. She sat in a beautiful seat, looked at the stage, and cried. Not because of the beauty of the music, but because she realized that her marriage was dying and there was nothing she could do about it. Point number 3, vacation, was discussed for a week. Cynthia found the perfect cottage in Kennebunkport, Maine. Ocean views, a fireplace, seclusion. But every suggestion was met with a wall of excuses. Who would feed Buddy? How would he cope with the separation? What if he got sick? "We can take him with us," Cynthia suggested in desperation. "He doesn't like the car. He'll get anxious. Then we'll find a place that accepts dogs. He's used to home." In the end, Cynthia canceled the reservation. $300 for the cancellation seemed like the cheapest loss in this war. The fourth point, renewing intimacy, proved to be the most painful. They hadn't made love in 4 months. Cynthia understood that grief could kill desire. But 4 months turned into a year, and the year threatened to turn into 2. She bought new lingerie, wine, and tried to create a romantic atmosphere. But when it came to touching, Mark became like a stone. Not now, Sin. I'm tired. You're always tired. It was a hard day. She lay next to him in the dark, listening to Buddy fidgeting on his mat, and felt like the loneliest woman in the world. Point 5, family therapy, met with unexpected resistance. We've already tried therapy, Mark said. It was right after Ethan. Now it's a different situation. Nothing has changed. Everything has changed, Mark. Back then, we grieved together. Now you grieve with the dog and I grieve alone. Mark was silent for a long time. Then he said, Dr. Wright said that everyone copes with loss in their own way. She said it's important not to lose each other. But we are losing each other. Maybe we already have. Those words sounded like a death sentence. Cynthia felt something break inside her. Not her heart. Her heart had broken 3 years ago. Something else. Hope, perhaps. But she didn't give up. She made an appointment with Dr. Wright for a private consultation. He's completely distanced himself from me, she told the psychologist in the familiar office with beige walls and artificial plants. I understand that he is suffering. But I am suffering too. Why can a dog comfort him, but I can't? Dr. Wright, a 50-year-old woman with gray hair and a soft voice, listened attentively. Animals give unconditional love, she explained. They don't expect anything in return. They don't require emotional work. They don't remind you of the past. For someone experiencing trauma, this may be the only form of relationship they can handle. What about me? I lost my son too, but you remind Mark of his loss. You were part of his life when Ethan was alive. The dog came after. He symbolizes the present, not the past. That's not fair. Grief is rarely fair, Cynthia. Dr. Wright suggested couples therapy, but warned, I can only help those who want help. If Mark isn't willing to work on the relationship, it will be difficult to change the situation. Mark wasn't ready. When Cynthia gave him Dr. Wright's phone number, he shoved the piece of paper into his jeans pocket, and it disappeared in the wash. Points 6 and 7, shared interests and planning for the future, weren't even tried. By mid-July, Cynthia realized her plan had failed. What's more, it only made the situation worse. Mark became even more withdrawn, and Buddy became even more important to him. The neighbors began to notice the changes. Mrs. Elizabeth Coffin, an elderly widow who lived across the street, saw Cynthia sitting alone on the porch with a glass of wine in the evenings. Mark was nowhere to be seen during the day. He left early in the morning and returned late at night, always with the dog. Something's wrong in that house, she told her sister Rose on the phone. That woman looks miserable, and the man seems to be avoiding his own home. Tommy also noticed the changes. Now muffled voices could often be heard coming from the Collins house. Not screams, but tense conversations. One evening, he saw Cynthia run out of the house in her bathrobe and slippers, get into her car, and drive away. She didn't return until morning. Maybe we should do something, he asked Dave at work. Like what? Knock on their door and ask if everything's okay? It's their business. But what if something happens? Nothing will happen. It's just normal family problems. Everyone has them. But Dave was wrong. Something was already happening. Something wrong and irreversible. At the end of July, an incident occurred that showed how far the conflict had gone. Cynthia came home from work and found that Buddy had torn her favorite shoes, expensive black pumps that she wore to important meetings. The dog was clearly bored alone and looking for a way to entertain himself. "Mark!" she shouted when she heard him come in. He came down the stairs, where he was changing after work. "Look what your dog did!" Mark glanced at the mangled shoes. "I'm sorry. I'll buy you new ones. It's not about the shoes. The point is, this dog is destroying our house. Don't exaggerate. I'm not exaggerating. She's everywhere. On the couch, in bed, in the kitchen. Hair everywhere. The smell, the dirt. I clean up after her. You don't. I clean up. I wash the bedspreads, vacuum the carpets, mop the floors. Mark bent down and petted Buddy, who was cowering at his feet, frightened by the shouting. You're scaring him, he said quietly. And you're scaring me. You've become someone I don't recognize. Maybe you didn't know me as well as you thought you did. That phrase stopped Cynthia. They looked at each other across the chasm that used to be their living room and realized they weren't talking about the dog or the shoes. They were talking about the end. Dr. Parker saw the results of this tension during his next visit in August. Buddy was healthy, but Mark looked exhausted. He had lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes. He answered questions about the house in monosyllables. Maybe you should see a family counselor, the vet suggested cautiously. Everything's fine, Mark replied, but there was no conviction in his voice. At night, Cynthia lay awake planning the divorce. She mentally divided up the property and calculated the alimony she would not receive since they no longer had children. She imagined herself in a small apartment in central Manchester, alone but not lonely, free from silence, from feelings of rejection, from fighting with the dog for her husband's attention. But something was holding her back. Maybe it was memories of how they used to be. Maybe it was the fear of loneliness, or perhaps stubbornness. The same trait that had helped her build her career now prevented her from admitting defeat in her marriage. August dragged on endlessly. The heat did not subside, and with it, the tension in the house on Maple Street did not subside either. The neighbors had grown accustomed to the silence coming from number 47, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence before the storm, which was about to break very soon. September brought the first cool nights to Manchester, but the atmosphere in the Collins house remained heated. Over the past month, the couple had practically stopped talking. They existed in the same space like ghosts, avoiding direct contact, communicating only when necessary with short, formal phrases. Cynthia lost 8 pounds. Her colleagues at Granite State Insurance began to notice that she had become distracted, forgot about meetings, and mixed up case numbers twice. Marilyn Curtis invited her to lunch several times, but received polite refusals. You look terrible, Marilyn said bluntly on Friday, September 13th, as she walked into Cynthia's office. What's going on? Cynthia looked up from her computer. There was such fatigue in them that Marilyn sat down on the edge of the table. Mark and I are going through a difficult period. Do you want to talk? Not here. Not now. But they never got to talk. Cynthia kept putting off the conversation, as if saying the problem out loud would make it more real. Mark had changed too. His construction company was losing clients. He was turning down big projects, not returning calls, missing meetings. 2 workers quit, unable to cope with his silence and unpredictable outbursts of irritation. Boss, maybe you should take some time off. Joe Moretti, his senior worker, a man who had been working with Mark for 8 years, suggested cautiously. Everything's fine, Mark replied, but his hands were shaking as he checked the blueprints. The only constant in his life was Buddy. The dog sensed the tension in the house and never left his owner's side. When Mark worked in the workshop, Buddy lay at his feet. When he watched TV, the dog curled up next to him on the sofa. At night, Buddy slept on a mat near the bed, but if Mark got up, he immediately followed him. Cynthia watched this attachment with growing despair. The dog received more attention, affection, and care from her husband than she had in the past 2 years. Buddy was not just a pet, he was a substitute for all the human relationships Mark had given up. The turning point came on Saturday, September 21st. Cynthia woke up early, around 7 in the morning, with a clear plan of action. She would make breakfast, and they would finally talk. Seriously, without evasions, without references to the dog, about their marriage, about the future, about whether they even wanted it. When she went down to the kitchen, she found a note on the table. Went to the construction site. Will be back for dinner. Emmy. Typical. Even on his day off, he found a way to avoid her company. Cynthia sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and allowed herself to cry. No sobbing, no hysterics, just quiet tears of disappointment. She gave herself 10 minutes to feel sorry for herself, then wiped her eyes and began cleaning up. Mark returned at 12:30. Buddy greeted him with joyful barking, twirling around his legs, demanding attention. Cynthia was preparing lunch, fried fish with rice, a simple, familiar dish. "How are things at the site?" she asked, without turning away from the stove. "Fine." "What did you do?" "Check the foundation." They sat down at the table. Buddy settled between them, as usual. They ate in silence for the first 15 minutes. "Mark," Cynthia began, putting down her fork, "we need to talk." He continued eating without looking up. "About what?" "About us. About what's happening with our marriage." "Nothing is happening." "Exactly. Nothing is happening. We live like roommates. We don't talk. We don't touch each other. We don't make plans." Mark finally looked at her. "What do you want me to say?" "I want to know if we have a future. Do you want to work on our relationship or what? Or we get a divorce?" The word rang out in the silence of the kitchen like a gunshot. Buddy looked up, sensing the tension. Mark was silent for a long time. Then he asked, "Is that an ultimatum?" "It's an attempt to save what's left of us." "What's left of us, Cynthia?" "Our son is dead. The house we bought for our family is now a tomb for two strangers. What exactly do you want to save?" "Us. What we meant to each other. We don't mean anything to each other." "We haven't for a long time." Cynthia felt tears welling up in her eyes. "We do. Or we did. 15 years of marriage can't just disappear. It can, and it has." She got up from the table and walked over to the window. In the yard, neighbors were barbecuing, children were playing on the swings, a normal family life, which they no longer had. "Fine," she said without turning around. "Then I'll file for divorce on Monday." "Do whatever you want." The coldness in his voice struck her more than the shouting. She turned to him. "Do you really not care?" "At all." Mark stroked Buddy behind the ear. The dog licked his hand gratefully. "I do care, Sin. I just can't pretend there's something between us anymore." "Is there something between you and the dog?" "Yes." A simple, honest admission. Cynthia felt something inside her break completely. "I see." She went upstairs to the bedroom and locked the door. She spent the next 2 hours staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out when exactly she had lost her husband. After Ethan's death? When Buddy came along? Or even earlier, and she just didn't notice? At 4:30, she went downstairs. Mark was sitting in the living room watching baseball on TV. Buddy was lying next to him with his head on his lap. "I'm going to Marilyn's," Cynthia said. "I'll be back late." Mark nodded without looking up from the screen. But she didn't go to Marilyn's. Instead, she got in the car and just drove around town aimlessly, trying to calm down. She stopped by the Merrimack River, sat on a bench, and looked at the water. Here, as children, she and Mark sometimes went fishing. Back then, he was different, laughing, dreamy, full of plans for the future. She returned home around 11. Mark was asleep, and Buddy was lying on the rug by the bed. She changed in the bathroom so as not to wake her husband and lay down on her side of the bed. Sunday passed in complete silence. Mark took Buddy for a long walk, came back for lunch, ate, and went back to his workshop. Cynthia cleaned the house, did the laundry, and made dinner, which they ate without saying a word. Monday began as usual. Mark left for work at 7 in the morning, Cynthia at 8. At the insurance company, she made an appointment to see a lawyer on Thursday. Marilyn noticed her red eyes but didn't ask any questions. When Cynthia came home that evening, she found that Buddy had chewed something up again. This time, it was her work documents, which she had left on the coffee table. Important papers for a major insurance case were torn to shreds. "Mark!" she shouted when she heard him come in. He came downstairs, saw the papers, and sighed. "I'm sorry. I'll buy a folder and you can put your documents away." "It's not about the folder. Your dog is ruining my life." "Don't exaggerate." "I'm not exaggerating. She's everywhere. Hair on all my clothes, dirt on the carpets. Now she's ruining my work." Buddy cowered in the corner, frightened by the shouting. "You're scaring him," Mark said. "Who's going to scare me? Who's going to protect my interests in this house? No one's bothering you." "You're not bothering me. You haven't bothered me in a year. I live with a husband who prefers a dog." Mark rubbed his face wearily with his hands. "Cynthia, we decided everything yesterday. File for divorce. We'll sell the house, divide the money, and go our separate ways. Why all this drama? Because it hurts. Do you understand? It hurts to see my husband love a dog more than me. I don't love anyone more. I just can't love people anymore. I can't do it." The confession sounded quiet, almost like an apology. Cynthia stood among the torn papers and realized he was telling the truth. Mark really couldn't love people anymore. Something inside him had broken after their son's death and hadn't been repaired. Then why can you love the dog? "I don't know. Probably because she doesn't demand anything. She's just there." Cynthia went to her room and cried, not out of anger, but out of understanding. She realized she had lost, not to the dog, but to grief. Grief that had taken not only her son, but also her husband. At night, she lay awake and thought about the future. An apartment in the city center, lonely dinners, empty weekends, starting life over at 42. And Mark would stay here, in their house, with the dog that had replaced his whole world. Around 3 in the morning, a thought came to her that at first seemed terrible. But the more she thought about it, the more logical it seemed. If she removed the cause of their problems, if Buddy disappeared, maybe Mark would come back to her. Maybe without the dog, he would learn to love people again. By Tuesday morning, the idea no longer seemed so terrible. By Wednesday, it had become a plan. On Thursday, after canceling her appointment with the lawyer, Cynthia went to the veterinary pharmacy on Dudley Street. She said they had rats in the basement and bought rat poison. The salesperson explained the dosage and warned her about precautions. Friday, September 27th, was the last day of Buddy's life. Cynthia waited until Mark left for work and mixed the poison with the wet food that the dog especially loved. She put the bowl in the yard and called Buddy. He came running happily, wagging his tail, trusting and unsuspecting. Cynthia stood at the kitchen window and watched the dog eat the poisoned food. Inside, she was horrified by what she was doing. But it was too late. The poison took effect an hour later. Buddy became lethargic and began to breathe heavily. By lunchtime, he was lying on the porch, unable to get up. Cynthia called Mark at work. "Something's wrong with Buddy." "He's sick." Mark rushed home in 15 minutes. Seeing the dog's condition, he immediately realized that it was serious. He wrapped Buddy in a blanket, put him in the truck, and rushed to Dr. Parker. It was too late. Buddy died on the way to the clinic. Mark returned home 2 hours later. Cynthia was waiting for him in the living room. He entered empty-handed, with a look on his face she hadn't seen since Ethan's death. "He's gone," Mark said quietly. "I'm so sorry." Mark sat down in the chair where he usually sat with the dog. He stared into space. Dr. Parker said it looks like poisoning. Cynthia felt a chill spread through her body. Poisoning? He could have eaten something in the yard. Or he looked at her. There was suspicion in his eyes. Or someone poisoned him. They looked at each other across the living room, and Cynthia realized, he knows. Not conclusively, but intuitively. He knew that Buddy hadn't died for no reason. "Why do you need this?" he asked very quietly. Cynthia couldn't lie, not after everything that had happened between them. "I thought without him, you would come back to me." Mark closed his eyes. When he opened them, There was so much hatred in them that Cynthia backed away. "You killed the only thing I had left. You have me. I have nothing." He got up and went upstairs. Cynthia heard him walking around the bedroom, gathering something. Half an hour later, he came downstairs with a travel bag. "Where are you going?" "To a motel. I don't want to be in the same house as you." "Mark, please, we can fix this." He stopped at the door. "You killed my dog to make me love you. You think that can be fixed?" The door slammed shut. Cynthia was left alone in the house, which suddenly seemed huge and empty. Mark didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. Monday, September 30th, began as a normal workday for Cynthia Collins. She woke up in her empty house on Maple Street, drank her coffee, and checked the weather forecast. It was drizzling outside, typical New Hampshire fall weather. Mark hadn't returned for 3 days. She called his cell phone, but he didn't answer. She left messages on his answering machine, begging him to talk, to explain, to forgive her. Silence was the only response. At 7:30 a.m., as Cynthia was getting ready to leave for work, there was a knock at the door. She thought it was the mailman and opened the door without looking through the peephole. Mark was standing on the doorstep. He looked terrible, unshaven in wrinkled clothes, with red eyes from lack of sleep. He was holding the house keys in his hands. "Mark!" She took a step toward him, but he raised his hand to stop her. "I need to get my things." "Of course. Please come in." "Can we talk?" He walked into the house without taking off his jacket. Cynthia closed the door and turned to him. "How are you?" "Where are you staying?" "At a motel on the highway." "Mark, I'm so sorry. What I did was wrong. I was desperate. I wasn't thinking straight." He stood in the hallway, staring at the empty spot by the door where Buddy usually lay, greeting him when he came home. "You killed him," he said quietly. "I know. And I regret it. If I could turn back time. But you can't." "No, but we can try to start over. Without him, maybe we'll find each other again." Mark finally looked at her. There was no anger or pain in his eyes, only emptiness. "You think that by killing my dog, you solved our problems?" "I thought I hoped. You hoped I would forget the only creature who loved me?" "I love you too." "No." Mark's voice was calm, almost indifferent. "You love the idea of me. You love who I used to be. But that person is gone." Cynthia felt tears welling up in her eyes. "We can get help. Therapy, medication, whatever. It's too late. It's never too late when people love each other." Mark slowly shook his head. "I don't love anyone else, Cynthia. I only loved him, and you killed him." "It was a dog, Mark. An animal. To you, yes. To me, he was the only reason to get up in the morning." Cynthia took a step closer. "What about me? I could be your reason. We can try." "We can't." "Why?" Mark was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because I hate you." The words came out simply, without emotion, as a statement of fact. Cynthia stepped back as if she had been slapped. "You can't mean that." "I can. You killed the only thing that connected me to life. You did it deliberately, in cold blood. And you think I can forgive you for that?" "People forgive worse things. Not me." Mark walked toward the stairs. Cynthia followed him. "Where are you going?" "To get my things. I'm moving in with my brother in Portland." "When?" "Today." Cynthia grabbed his sleeve. "Mark, please. Give us another chance." He stopped without turning around. "Let go of me. I love you. And I hate you. And I will hate you for the rest of my life." Something in his voice frightened her. She let go of his sleeve and stepped back. Mark went upstairs. Cynthia heard him walking around the bedroom, opening closets, packing his things. Half an hour later, he came downstairs with 2 bags. "I'm filing for divorce next week," he said, heading for the door. "What about the house?" We'll sell it. I don't want to live here anymore. Mark, she tried to approach him again. Don't come near me. There was such hatred in his voice that Cynthia stopped. Mark opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Mark! She cried. I'm sorry! Forgive me. He turned around. His face was like stone. Never! The door slammed. Cynthia heard the truck start up and drive out of the driveway, then silence. But Mark hadn't left. He drove a block, stopped, turned off the engine. He sat in the cab, clutching the steering wheel, thinking about the dead dog, the ruined life, the woman who had killed the last thing he had. The hatred he had carried inside him for 3 days finally burst out. Mark returned an hour later. Cynthia was in the shower and didn't hear him come into the house. He went upstairs and quietly pushed open the bathroom door. She was standing under the stream of water, her back to the door, unaware of his presence. What happened next took less than a minute. At 9:47 a.m., neighbor Tommy Henderson heard a scream coming from the Collinses' house. It was a piercing, terrified scream that ended as suddenly as it had begun. Tommy had been working the night shift and had just returned home, ready to go to bed. The scream made him go to the window. House number 47 looked normal. No one in the yard, no signs of disturbance. Tommy waited a few minutes, but there were no more sounds. Maybe he had imagined it. Or maybe Cynthia had seen a mouse. Women sometimes scream at such trifles. But something bothered him. The scream was too frightened, too desperate for an encounter with a mouse. At 10:30, Tommy saw a man come out of the house. Tall, wearing a dark jacket, he walked quickly to a truck parked on the street. He couldn't see his face. The man kept his head down. The truck drove away. Tommy didn't know if it was Mark or someone else, but his uneasiness grew. At noon, he decided to check it out. He approached the Collinses' house and knocked on the door. No one answered. Cynthia's car was in the driveway, so she must have been home. Tommy walked around the house and looked into the first-floor windows. The living room and kitchen were empty, but tidy. There were no signs of a struggle or disorder. He returned to the front door and tried the handle. The door was unlocked. "Cynthia?" he called, stepping over the threshold. "Mrs. Collins?" Silence. Tommy walked through the living room and peered into the kitchen. Everything looked normal, but something was wrong. The house seemed too quiet, too empty. He went upstairs. "Cynthia? Are you home?" No one was in the bedroom. The bed was made, the clothes neatly folded. Tommy heard the sound of dripping water coming from the bathroom. The bathroom door was ajar. Tommy pushed it open and froze. Cynthia Collins was lying in the bathtub, under the stream of the still-running shower. The water was red with blood. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but seeing nothing. Tommy ran out of the house and called the police. Detective Rachel Morris arrived at the scene at 12:34 p.m. She was 38 years old and had been working in the Manchester Police Homicide Division for 6 years. A divorced mother of 2, she knew a thing or two about human passions and family tragedies. First responders had already cordoned off the house with yellow tape. Tommy Henderson was giving a statement to Sergeant Dave Richardson by the patrol car. "What do we have?" Morris asked Richardson. "Cynthia Collins, 42 years old, found dead in the bathroom of her own home. Multiple stab wounds. Discovered by a neighbor around noon. Witnesses? So far, only the person who found the body. Tommy Henderson lives next door. Says he heard a scream around 10 in the morning." Morris surveyed the house from the outside. A typical suburban neighborhood, a quiet street. Not the kind of place you'd expect to see a murder. Inside the house, she went straight to the bathroom. Forensic expert Johnny Palmer was already photographing the crime scene. "Preliminary findings?" Morris asked. "At least 7 stab wounds, most of them to the chest and abdomen. Judging by the nature of the wounds, the attacker was to the right of the victim, right-handed, used a kitchen knife, found it in the sink, washed. Time of death? Approximately between 9 and 11 in the morning. I'll be able to say more after the autopsy. Morris examined the bathroom carefully. No signs of a struggle. The victim had been caught off guard in the shower and had no time to defend herself. There was no forced entry, she noted. The killer came in through the front door. The door was unlocked when the neighbor found her, Palmer added. Morris went downstairs and examined the living room and kitchen. Everything was in order. Nothing had been stolen. The victim's car keys and wallet with cash and credit cards were on the kitchen table. Not a robbery, she stated. Sergeant Richardson approached her with his notebook. I spoke to the neighbor who found the body. Tommy Henderson, 28 years old, works at a factory. He says the Collins family was going through a difficult period. He often heard arguments in recent months. Where's the husband? Unknown. The neighbor saw a man leave the house around 10:30 this morning, get into a truck and drive away. He didn't see his face. We need to find Mark Collins. Find out where he is, check his alibi. Morris went out into the yard, where Tommy Henderson was smoking a cigarette, waiting for further questions. Mr. Henderson, tell me about the Collins family. Tommy took a drag and slowly exhaled the smoke. Quiet people, kept to themselves. But something had been wrong in recent months. What exactly? Arguments, not shouting but tense conversations, especially in the evenings. And their dog died recently. The dog? Yes, Mr. Collins was very attached to her after, well, their son died a few years ago. A car accident. He's been withdrawn ever since, and the dog was his only joy. What happened to the dog? It got sick and died last week. Mr. Collins left home after that. I haven't seen him for 3 days. Morris recorded the testimony. The picture was beginning to clear up. Family problems, the death of a pet, temporary separation of spouses, classic precursors to domestic violence. Did you see Mr. Collins this morning? I saw him arrive. It was around 8 o'clock. Then, at 10:30, I saw someone leave the house and drive away in a truck, but I couldn't make out their face. Describe the truck. A dark blue pickup truck. A Ford, I think. I've seen it here before. It's Mr. Collins's car. Morris closed her notebook. She had a prime suspect. Now she had to find him. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she received information from the dispatcher. Mark Collins was registered at the Comfort Inn Motel on Highway 101. The manager confirmed that he had left that morning around 7:30, but had not taken his belongings and had paid for the room until the next day. Issue an APB on Mark Collins and his truck, Morris ordered, wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of his wife. By evening, Detective Morris had a fairly complete picture of the Collins family and their problems. Neighbors reported tension in the home, and Cynthia's colleagues confirmed that she had seemed depressed in recent months and had spoken of family difficulties. The most important information came from Dr. James Parker, the veterinarian who had treated the Collins dog. Buddy died of poisoning, he told Morris on the phone. Rat poison. When Mr. Collins brought him in, it was already too late. He was, how should I put it, devastated. More than people usually react to the death of a pet, did he say anything about how the dog might have been poisoned? He mentioned that he suspected intentional poisoning. I thought maybe the neighbors, but now, considering the circumstances, Dr. Parker didn't finish his sentence, but Morris understood. Mark Collins suspected his wife of killing the dog, and now his wife is dead. The motive was becoming obvious. Mark Collins was found on Tuesday, October 1st at 6:30 a.m. Patrol Officer Mike Turner noticed a dark blue Ford pickup truck in the parking lot of Danny's 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Manchester. The driver sat in the cab, staring motionless at the windshield. Detective Morris arrived on the scene 20 minutes later. Mark did not resist arrest. When Officer Turner knocked on the truck window, he simply nodded and got out of the vehicle. Mark Collins, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Cynthia Collins, Morris announced as she handcuffed him. I know, he replied quietly. Mark didn't say a word on the way to the station. He sat in the back seat of the patrol car, looking out the window at the houses, trees, and ordinary life passing by, continuing despite the fact that his own had ended. At the police station, he was placed in a holding cell. Morris gave him an hour to compose himself, then began the interrogation. The interrogation room was standard. Gray walls, a metal table, 2 plastic chairs, a video camera in the corner. Mark sat quietly, his hands folded on the table. He looked tired, but not scared. "Do you want a lawyer?" Morris asked, turning on the tape recorder. "No." "Do you understand what you're being charged with?" "Yes." "Tell me what happened yesterday morning." Mark was silent for a long time. Then he spoke slowly, as if each word came with difficulty. "I came to get my things. I was going to move in with my brother in Portland." "What time did you arrive?" "Around 8 in the morning." "Was Cynthia home?" "Yes. She was getting ready for work." "What did you talk about?" Mark closed his eyes. "She apologized for what she did to Buddy." "What did she do to Buddy?" "She poisoned him." Morris showed no surprise, even though this was the first direct confirmation of her theory. "How do you know?" "She confessed. On Friday, when I came back from the vet. She said she thought that without the dog, I would come back to her. And what did you say?" "That I hated her." "And yesterday morning?" Mark opened his eyes. There was no remorse in them, only endless fatigue. "She asked for forgiveness again. She said we could start over, and I said I would never forgive her. I went upstairs to get my things, and then?" A long pause. The only sound in the room was the hum of the fan. "Then I heard her turn on the shower. And I thought about Buddy, how he trusted her, how he ate poison from her hands." "What did you do?" "I took a knife from the kitchen, went upstairs, and I killed her." The confession sounded simple, emotionless. Morris recorded the testimony, trying not to betray her feelings. "Why?" Mark looked at her for the first time since the interrogation began. "She killed the only thing I had left. The only thing that loved me. It was a dog, Mr. Collins. For you, yes. For me, Buddy was my last connection to life. After my son died, I almost died myself. The dog helped me survive, and she killed him, but murder. I didn't plan it. I just couldn't stop myself. When I saw her in the shower, I thought about how Buddy had died in agony, and..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Morris understood. 3 years of grief, months of pent-up hatred, the death of his dog, it all came pouring out in a moment of madness. "What did you do after that?" "I washed the knife. I left. I drove aimlessly until I ran out of gas." "Do you regret what you did?" Mark closed his eyes again. "I regret that she poisoned Buddy. I don't know about the rest." The interrogation continued for another 2 hours. Mark recounted in detail the last months of their marriage, the conflicts over the dog, how Cynthia tried to make him choose between her and Buddy. "I chose the dog," he said, "because she loved me just the way I was. She didn't demand anything in return. And your wife did? She wanted me to get back to living, to make plans, to dream about the future. But I couldn't. After Ethan, something inside me broke." Morris understood the psychology of a grieving parent. She had seen similar cases before, but they didn't usually end in murder. "What happens now?" Mark asked at the end of the interrogation. "Trial. Most likely, life imprisonment." He nodded as if that suited him. Detective Morris spent the next 2 days gathering additional evidence. Dr. Parker confirmed that Buddy had indeed died of rat poison. The salesperson at the veterinary pharmacy identified Cynthia from a photograph. She had purchased the poison on Thursday, the day before the dog's death. Cynthia's colleagues said that she had looked exhausted in recent weeks and had talked about serious family problems. Marilyn Curtis admitted that Cynthia had hinted at a possible divorce. Neighbors confirmed the chronology of events on Monday morning. Mrs. Coffey saw Mark park his truck outside the house around 8 a.m. Tommy Henderson heard a scream at 9:47 a.m. and saw the man leave the house at 10:30 a.m. A forensic examination determined the exact time of death to be between 9:45 and 9:50 a.m. This corresponded with Tommy's testimony about the time of the scream. Mark's court-appointed attorney attempted to negotiate a plea bargain in exchange for a reduced sentence. But Hillsborough County Prosecutor Jennifer Hall was adamant. This was premeditated murder, she told reporters. The defendant came to the house with the intent to harm his wife, took a knife, and cold-bloodedly killed her. The trial began in January 2026. The case received widespread coverage in the local press. The union leader wrote about the tragedy of a family torn apart by grief. WMUR television ran a story about how the death of a child can drive parents to crime. Mark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. At the trial, he was calm, answered questions in monosyllables, and showed no emotion. Dr. Susan Wright, a family psychologist, testified about the state of the Collinses after their son's death. They experienced the loss differently, she explained to the court. Cynthia tried to get back to her life, while Mark sank into depression. The dog became a substitute for human relationships for him. Could the death of an animal provoke violence? Asked the prosecutor. In this case, yes. For Mark, the loss of the dog was equivalent to losing his child again. The defense tried to prove that the murder was committed in the heat of passion, but the video recording of the interrogation showed that Mark acted deliberately. He washed the knife after the murder, calmly left the house, and made no attempt to hide or create an alibi. Tommy Henderson testified as a witness. He recounted what he heard and saw on the morning of the murder. In the courtroom, he appeared uncertain, frequently glancing at Mark. "I knew something was wrong in that family," he said, "but I never thought it would come to this." The verdict was announced on February 15, 2026. Judge William Grant sentenced Mark Collins to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "The murder of one's wife cannot be justified by any circumstances," the judge said. "Whatever your personal tragedies may be, they do not give you the right to take another person's life." Mark listened to the sentence standing, his face expressionless. As he was led away in handcuffs, he turned to the courtroom and said, "I'm sorry it turned out this way." The house on Maple Street was sold a month after the trial. The new owners knew nothing about the tragedy that had taken place there. They painted the walls, replaced the carpets, and planted a new garden. Tommy Henderson moved to another part of Manchester. He told his friends that he could no longer live near the place where the murder had taken place. Dr. Parker continued to work as a veterinarian, but the story of the Collins family changed his approach to his clients. He now paid more attention to the psychological state of pet owners, especially those who had experienced loss. A year later, Detective Morris was promoted and transferred to the Serious Crimes Department. The Collins case became an example for her of how family tragedies can lead to irreparable consequences. "Grief makes people unpredictable," she told Police Academy students when discussing the case. "It is important to notice the signs of impending violence in time." Mark Collins is serving his sentence at a correctional facility in New Hampshire. He keeps to himself, follows the rules, and works in the prison library. He participates in a support group for inmates who have lost children. Psychologists note that he is gradually accepting responsibility for his actions. In a letter to his brother in Portland, he wrote, "I understand now that Cynthia was not my enemy. She was suffering too, just in a different way. It's a pity I realized this too late." Every year, flowers appear on Cynthia's grave at Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Manchester. They are brought by Marilyn Curtis, who cannot forget her friend. Their son Ethan is buried next to his wife's grave. Mark's grave is still empty. By law, he cannot be buried next to the wife he killed. The story of the Collins family has become a warning to other families experiencing loss. His love for his dog and hatred for his wife drove the man to murder. Tommy Henderson sometimes drives past the old house, where a young family with 2 children now lives. He sees toys in the yard, hears children laughing, and it makes him feel better. Life goes on, even where death once occurred. But he will never forget the scream he heard on the morning of September 30th, and the man in the dark jacket who left the house, taking with him the secret of the murder, which soon became known to the whole town.